And welcome to another webinar in our series on trustee roles and responsibilities. My name's Tracy Bird, and I run the SCVO Trustee Network, which is sponsored by Rathbones. And they're one of the leading charity investment managers in the UK, and their support enables us to offer these free sessions to our members. So while we're waiting for everyone to join us, I was hoping that you might just introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us the one thing you wish you'd been told before you became a trustee. And if you're not a trustee yet, just let us know that as well, please, so we can gauge who we have here today. So thank you for joining us. And just to note that the presentations during this session, we're recording them, but we're going to switch off the recording before we go to questions at the end. And that's just if you have any contentious issues you'd like to discuss with us, that's the time to do it. Or you can get in touch afterwards and we can set up a one-to-one session. And to note, we'll send out all the slides to you afterwards and links to further resources in a follow-up email. So we're running these webinars because we recognise how important it is that as a trustee, you know what to expect and what's expected of you when you join a board. And I'm delighted that we have with us today Leanne Lodge, and she's a partner at Gillespie Macandrew. And they're one of our partner firms in SCVO's free legal advice service. And Leanne has supported SCVO members for many years and has been a charity trustee herself. And she's going to take us through the key legal responsibilities of a charity trustee. I just mentioned there the SCVO free legal advice service. And for anyone that doesn't know much about it, it's open to SCVO members with an income of less than £500,000. And that gives you access to up to 2 hours free legal advice on all manner of topics, ranging from governance and charity law to property and employment law. So again, if you've got any particular legal questions you want to ask that you'd rather not share in the webinar, you can contact us afterwards and we can make a referral to one of our partner firms. So just before I hand over to Leanne, I'm going to start by looking at why induction and regular training and board development is so important for trustees to help them understand their role and responsibilities. And I'm also going to talk you through some of the ways SCVO can help with resources and e-learning. But just before I do that, can I just ask you to tell me whether or not you received an induction when you first became a trustee? So we're going to launch a poll, and it's just a simple yes or no answer. When you first became a trustee, did you get an induction? So we'll just watch the ticking here as we go. It's looking like an even spread up to now. Okay, that's great. So the majority of you didn't get an induction. 56% and 44% did. So that's a pretty even split, but obviously not that good if more than half of you didn't get an induction. Thanks for taking part in that. So I'm just going to launch my slides now and really ask the question, why is trustee training and induction so important? So can you see my slides there? There they go. That's my colleague Rhonda's helping me out. Thanks, Rhonda. So trustees have to be prepared and equipped to make good collective decisions so your organisation can be as effective and sustainable as possible. So if you just move on to the next slide, Rhonda, thanks. And I think, and I hope, in any paid job role that you would take on, you'd learn about the role and responsibilities in the organisation. And just because trusteeship's unpaid, it really shouldn't be any different. You should get a good induction. So at the next slide, with this in mind, we've got lots of resources on our website for trustees. And this also includes information on where you can advertise your vacancies and what you need to think about for a trustee induction. So that also includes a link to a sample induction checklist, which you can see here. It's quite difficult to read on the screen, but you can download this from our website and you can add your own specific ideas for your own organisation. But this list here includes all the essentials you would need to give to new trustees, such as a copy of the governing document and accounts and previous minutes. And I would say, as well as giving these to your new recruits, you really need to ensure they've read them and they understand these key documents. And also, trustees should be able to visit your organisation and meet with existing trustees and staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, and service users, and have a full understanding of what expenses they can claim. Think about giving an existing trustee as a mentor to a new one, and make sure you continue to develop your board with ongoing training and support, because a good induction, that's going to set the groundwork for the future. And also think about checking in with your new trustees after 6 months to ensure their knowledge and understanding is as it should be. So we have got a bank of model templates and policies that SCVO members can download. And these include a conflict of interest policy, a code of conduct, a scheme of delegation, and one on trustee expenses. Check them out. And if you think there's any gaps there, do let us know, and we can work on new topics for you. And I would say with your policies, your templates, it's important to have these documents agreed by all your trustees and available for reference if anything should go wrong. An example would be an effective board. You've got to act as a team, but sometimes you do get personality clashes and, dare I say, some bad behavior. So if you have a robust code of conduct setting out expected standards, it's not going to solve everything, but you can use it to address any issues and start what might be potentially a difficult conversation. Also on our website, we've got the Scope e-learning platform, and I think this is a great induction tool. It's also a good refresher for trustees. It's got 5 modules covering governance, finance, fundraising, communications, and risk management. And the beauty of that one is you can complete your learning at a time and a place that suits you. We've also got the Trustee Network, which I hope you're all signed up to. And that provides support and guidance to members of committees and boards with a regular news bulletin and webinars like this. And then finally, when you're all working well together and things are going marvellously, why not check up how you measure up to the Third Sector Governance Code? SCVO has created a digital tool, our Good Governance Checkup, where individuals can answer questions about the 5 principles of the code. And these are organizational purpose, leadership, board behavior, control, and effectiveness. And the checkup takes about 30 minutes to complete. You get a personalized action plan at the end and an opportunity to book some time in with us for one-to-one support on governance. And everybody that completes the checkup, you're helping us as an organisation gather an accurate picture of the quality of governance in organisations across Scotland. So some of the things that we've discovered looking at all the checkups is that most trustees don't get an existing trustee as a mentor, and most are not asked for a reference before appointment either. So they're just some of the things that are coming out from the results. So I've done a whistle-stop tour there of the resources that we have that can help you as a trustee. And please do contact our information service if you've got any specific queries on governance or really anything else, really. So thank you for listening to me. And now I'm going to hand over to Leanne for her presentation. So I would say use the chat as we go to ask questions and make your own suggestions so we can make this as interactive as possible. And we'll have time to cover these at the end. So over to you now, Leanne. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy. Can everybody hear me? And is the screen showing okay?
Yeah. All looking good, yeah. Thanks.
Great. So just before I start, first of all, thank you to Tracy and the team at SCVO for inviting me to speak today. As she mentioned, yes, I'm a lawyer and I'm the head of the charities team at Gillespie Macandrew, but I think actually more importantly is the fact that I'm a charity trustee myself, because I think it's very easy from a legal perspective to sit and look at best practice, but you also need to look at what's actually happening, what's practical for organisations of all different sizes. So hopefully today I'll try to cover a little bit of that with a bit of practical side of things. Before I get into this, first of all, round of applause for everybody who wore a Christmas jumper today. I should have put that in the invite that was mandatory. So thank you very much for those who made the effort. I wish I had thought to do that. But secondly, I think it was Wendy had put in the chat that she was quite surprised that she had to be responsible for the income. The presentation that I've done today focuses on the kind of specific legal duties, but I think before I get into that, it's worth just revisiting for new trustees that actually charity trustees are responsible for the organisation itself. The buck stops with them, which is quite a tricky position to be in sometimes, where you're a volunteer, you're maybe meeting a few times a year, you have staff who are doing the day-to-day operations. So it is important that the role that you're signing up to is there's quite a level of responsibility that comes with it. You are volunteers, you are volunteering your time, you're not getting paid for that. But ultimately, to protect yourself, I think it's really important that you understand the nuts and bolts of what the organisation does and what your role in it should be. So today, I thought I would chat a little bit about being charity trustee. That will be the focus of it. I'll touch on the Charities Act. There's been loads of stuff out about that, so I'll just swing by it briefly because it would be remiss not to. And then a little bit about future-proofing your organisation, because the legislation that's coming through just now, a regulation is potentially a better word for it, for charities. It's full of acronyms. There's more coming through almost daily, and it's quite an uncomfortable position to be in. So I thought I would spend a little bit of time about what might cover that. So being a charity trustee, first and foremost, I'm getting the bad news out of the way first. I'm talking about the responsibility. I'm talking about the things that can go wrong. But actually, there's a lot to be said for being a charity trustee. I think during COVID, we saw how much our voluntary organisation means in Scotland, and it's a really thriving sector. So much good is done by the sector. So let's not underplay this. But looking at the downside of it, if something does go wrong and charity trustees are deemed to be personally negligent or liable for what they're doing, OSCR, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, could suspend or disqualify you from acting as a trustee. They could impose a fine of up to £5,000 or imprisonment for up to 6 months. Never seen that happen, but in theory it could. I should say they have to go to court to do that. So, they're not going to travel from Dundee, knock at your door with the handcuffs. There will be a process involved in the back of that, but still, it is a risk. Also, if your charity is a company as well as a charity, so company limited by guarantee or potentially just a limited company, depending on your structure, the directors of the company are the charity trustees, and they also have to comply with Companies House. So that means making sure that changes to directors are lodged in time, accounts are lodged in time, and that side of things. So in terms of the duties or the personal risks, the biggest one, I think, realistically, is a reputational risk if things go wrong with a charity and you're involved with. That reputational risk is going to become a little bit bigger soon because, as I'll come on to later, there is going to be a public register of charity trustees, which will be publicly available on OSCR's website, so you will be able to search for that. So if you're involved with an organisation and there's things going wrong, it's very easy for the public in the future to be able to find out who the trustees are. So there is a heightened awareness in the public of trustees, which is great for transparency, but for us as individuals, as trustees, it does come with its own problems. If you are a charity that's constituted in a way that's not incorporated, so by that I mean companies are incorporated and SCVOs, Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, are incorporated. But if you are a trust or an unincorporated organisation, so effectively a club or a membership organisation, then conceivably the individual trustees could be liable if things go wrong. So that means that, for example, if the organisation was sued, then it's the individual trustees who would be sued as a collective rather than the organisation itself. Now, obviously, the organisation would be liable to meet the funds, but if the organisation has run out of funds, then it could be the trustees who are personally left holding the can. In terms of your risks as trustees, the way that the law is such that each of the trustees is jointly or severally liable, which means that each of the trustees is responsible as a collective. So even if you don't agree with the decision, if the board has made the decision, then you would be liable as well. In theory, the court might look at that slightly differently if you objected, but that is the nuts and bolts of it. That is the default position, which means that if somebody is going to sue, and again, it never happens, but it could. So they could drive round, look at who's got the biggest house and the nicest car and sue them, and it would be up to them to bring the other trustees into it. So as I say, it doesn't tend to happen, but it is a risk. And therefore, if you are a charity trustee, I would encourage you to look at your structure and to understand your structure. And if you see that you are a trust or you are an unincorporated organisation, have a think about what the risk might be of that. So if, for example, you are a grant giving trust and you sit in a pot of money that you give out every so often when you get grant applications in, your risk is probably quite low because you're unlikely to be sued for doing that. If, however, you're an unincorporated organisation and you're running a children's gymnastic club, what if there's an accident? Are you employing people? Have they been subject to the disclosures and things like that? So the risk goes up then. So have a think about what type of organisation you are and if it's the right type of organisation for what you as a particular charity are doing. Okay, that's the bad news out of the way. It will be more positive from here before everybody logs off and says, why on earth am I signing up for this? So we're moving on to the better stuff. So first of all, if things do go wrong, there's obviously insurance can be put in place. So there's two main types of insurances that charities will likely have. The first is trustees indemnity insurance. Now that is insurance for the benefit of the trustees. So using that example that I gave earlier where the trustees are sued, this could kick in. It protects the trustee, not the charity. It can cover legal expenses and civil awards, but it's important to know it doesn't protect you if you acted out with your powers, you were negligent, or you broke the law. Arguably, therefore, if you acted within your powers with due care and you didn't break the law, the court's unlikely to hold you liable. So is it worth it? But it does pay your legal fees. So it's up to every organisation, but it's something to think about. Public liability insurance is a more classic type of insurance that protects a charity. So that's what I think would be key for most charities. So just make sure that you know A, that it's in place, and B, what it's covering. Is it on a claims made basis, which is when pays out based on when the claim is actually intimated, or is it on a claims occurring basis? Does it cover you for the action that happened? So, the liability happened in year 1, but it didn't claim to year 2, which insurance is involved. So just try to get a handle for that. So in terms of statutory trustees' duties, this is what the Act says, and it's not rocket science, and I think most people would adhere to it, but I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail and examples of where it might occur. So trustees must act in the best interests of the charity. That should go without saying. I come on to conflicts later, but there often can be conflicts of interest that comes with this. Often people who are on the board of a charity are there because they have a vested interest either in that charity or in doing good generally. So they might be on the board of more than one charities. One might be applying for funding from the other. They might be applying to the same source of funding. All of those could be conflicts. They must act in a manner consistent with its purposes. Now, it's key, therefore, to understand what the charity's purposes are. Tracy spoke at the beginning about the induction pack, and I think that was a really useful help list. But I think the one thing that is vital in all of that is to get a copy of the charity's constitution. That is different from the charity's strategy, the charity's mission statement, the charity's vision. The constitution is a legal document that forms and regulates a charity. What we sometimes find is that the purposes that are set out in there have had a little bit of mission creep over time. So for example, I was acting for an organisation which it was set up to help female survivors of sexual violence. Okay, great. But actually they were helping their families, they were helping their children, they were helping their boyfriends or girlfriends, they were also helping trans people. So they were doing very good things, but it wasn't quite in their constitution. So in that case, we changed the constitution. You can absolutely do that with Oscar's consent, but just make sure that what you're doing is consistent with the charity's purposes. It's not crept slightly over time, and it's key to pull it back to that. And it was the constitution itself, not the strategy or anything else, that will show you that. Declare any conflicts of interest and manage it effectively. I'll come on to that at the moment, at the end of the slide, because there's quite a bit to say on that. The duty of care that you owe to a charity is it's a duty of care of a reasonable person. So I'm a lawyer, obviously, and I sit on the board of charities. Strictly speaking, I wouldn't be expected as a charity trustee to know any more or less about the law than a regular person, a reasonable person on the street. But it's key that I am brought into that board for those skills in that area, for those analytical skills and for my expertise. So while from the court's perspective, you're not, or from a legislative perspective, you're not held to a higher standard, in reality, you potentially would be, and particularly around your reputational risk, I think that has a different impact. When it comes to the financial side of things, your duty of care is a higher duty of care than if you were dealing with your own side of things. So you have to be more cautious. I could decide tomorrow to go and put £100 on the horses at Ayr Racecourse and hope that that's a good investment because I got a tip. I don't have a tip. I don't even know if there's horses racing tomorrow. But I couldn't do that with charity funds because their level of risk, their appetite for risk is lower than mine as an individual. So it is a different duty of care. Be careful not to overcommit. And I mean that in two ways. It's meant from a financial standpoint, so make sure that you can pay your bills and pay your legacies. But actually, potentially more importantly, I think, is don't overcommit your resources. It's very easy to say people who are involved in charities want to help, they want to do things, but sometimes the best thing you can do for your charity is to say no. So consider really carefully whether you have the skills, the resources, and the funding to do anything, rather than just the financial side of things. Two things that aren't on there, but it's something, so they're not listed as trustees' duties in the traditional sense, but actually the trustees are responsible for making sure it happens. And I'm seeing less and less, or more and more problems where it's not happening, is to keep a list of your members. So understand the structure of your organisation. If it's a membership organisation, then who are your members? Do you engage with them? If things go wrong, or if you want to make changes to the charity, it's likely the members who have to vote on that. So do you have annual meetings? Do you have an audit? Do you have an up-to-date list of who your members are? People have potentially come onto your board, but might not automatically be members of the organisation. What do they need to do to become members? Often it's not, for traditional membership, it's easy because they pay a subscription and they get to go to the club or whatever it is. But a lot of organisations, particularly community organisations, people can be members without paying a subscription, and that's harder to keep track of. So make sure you understand the structure and who your members are. I spoke a little bit earlier about the purposes in the Constitution, but I would encourage new trustees to do a cheat sheet for themselves of the organisation itself. So work out what the purposes are at the heart. How many trustees do you need? How often do you need to have a meeting? Can you meet online or does it need to be in person? When somebody's a trustee, how long are they a trustee for? Is it fixed term appointments? All of that will be covered in the Constitution. It doesn't mean that you can't have a policy that adds to that, but your Constitution has to be the minimum and you must comply with that. So it's important that you look back to the heart of that. So to give an example, you might have an organisation that meets every quarter. Great, but is that okay? Does the Constitution allow for that, or does the Constitution say that it's every month? You might have a Constitution that says you need to meet every year and you meet every quarter. Brilliant, more is more. You don't need to only have the meetings that are covered in the Constitution, but that's your minimum. So I can't stress enough, to be honest, I probably have stressed enough and everybody wants me to move on, but go back to the Constitution and work out exactly what it says and why it says it. And if there's anything that you see the charity doing that doesn't fit neatly, that you can't draw a line directly to the Constitution, ask. You have been invited onto the board because you're bringing something to it, so please don't feel that you can't ask. It's entirely refreshing where all of the trustees engage and ask what may be stupid questions, because often it's not a stupid question at all and the rest of the board have either been wondering it or have just gone along because that's the way it's always been done. Nobody's stopped to think about why is it done that way and can we do it a different way. So I would encourage you all to do that. Conflicts of interest. So as Tracy said, they've got an excellent conflict of interest policy that you can download, but beware, it is my thinking, to make sure that you use a conflict of interest policy that works for you. So I've seen a lot of people adopt standard conflict of interest policy, but when you get to it, it doesn't work. So you might have a family grant giving organisation, and your conflict of interest policy might say that the people can't vote if they or their close family members are conflicted. Well, actually, if they're all close family members, nobody can vote. And how's that going to work? I had another organisation that I dealt with that the conflict of interest policy said if there were appointment conflicts, so for example, if they were looking to do something with the community council and the community council appointed a majority of trustees, then those trustees couldn't vote, at which point we were in quorate, and therefore it was a stalemate. So think about practically what that conflict of interest policy will mean for your charity. How will it play out? You might want to tweak it a little bit. So say, well, actually, yes, the conflicted people shouldn't be able to form part of the conversation at all. They should be excluded, or they should be invited in to give their opinion but not vote on it, provided the conflict has been declared. There's lots of different ways to do it, and what's right for your organisation will be entirely dependent on that organisation itself. Ideally, you're going for the strictest view possible, but if that doesn't work for your organisation, you can step it back piece by piece, but just make sure that it's still compliant. The most important thing with the conflict policy is that you follow it, because the amount of people that will have the policy, approve it, and stick it in the file and never look at it again is significant. If there is a conflict of interest, it should be declared at the start of a meeting. I would suggest that it's a standing point at the start of every agenda, of every meeting, to say, is there any conflicts of interest? And that flushes it out before you go down that route. And if you have had to follow your conflict of interest policy, minute that you did that. So the minutes of that meeting should declare that trustee X had a conflict. They were party to the discussion until that particular item agenda came, where they left the meeting, a vote was had, and they came back in thereafter. Or same scenario, trustee X had a conflict. The trustees felt that it was in the best interest of the charity for them to be party to the discussion, as they had valuable input. However, they were not allowed to vote. Whatever you do, make sure that it's minuted, because if for any reason somebody asks a question, having it minuted that you either complied with your conflict policy, or if you deviated from it, there were very good reasons to do so, and those are minuted, is really good evidence to protect that the trustees are acting in the best interest of the charity at all time. So it's a topic that I think Oscar are getting a little bit hotter on. I think it's something that they're quite interested in at the moment. There's been lots of conflict of interest things going on with Captain Tom's headlines and all the rest of it. So it's something just to be careful of and go canny with. Charity trustees also have specific investment duties. So if you're lucky enough that the charity that you're involved with has investments, now cash can be an investment. That in itself, if you've got a reserve of cash, that is an investment. You've made the decision to keep it in cash rather than to do something else with it. So most organisations should consider the investment side of things. So the statutory duties are, you have to consider the need of diversification of investment if appropriate. You don't need to diversify, you just need to have thought about it. So if, for example, your charity has a lot of capital, but it's in a building, then it might be that your charity uses that building, so it's not appropriate to diversify because it's going to give up that building. If, however, your charity does something entirely different, but it has no investments and just has a building that's an investment effectively that you're getting rent from, is that the right thing? What if the rental market goes down? What if the capital goes down? It's not to say it's the wrong thing, but it's something you need to consider. Consider the suitability of investments to the trust. Now, that has moved on hugely since the 2005 Act. When I first started to do this, basically most charity trustees would say no tobacco, no arms, and no alcohol, potentially. Now, then it went to fossil fuels. Now, there's a much bigger expectation that you're looking at more ESG. So it might not be that you're ruling things out, but you might be ruling things in. You might be saying that actually we want to invest in this organisation because it aligns with our charitable purposes. I have a charity who's, I'm not suggesting this is for everybody, but I have a charity who has a massive income which is guaranteed, and they're a healthcare charity. And they decided to invest in a really small startup company who were based in really remote parts of Africa, or South America, actually, I think it was. And it was about apps which gave you access to healthcare. So quite a techie thing, but they felt that it aligned with their charitable purposes, because it got healthcare into these places. Yes, it was a riskier investment, but they considered whether it was appropriate for them, given that they already had the guaranteed income. So it can be more than just ruling in and out stocks and shares. It's also it says here the suitability of investments to the trust. That should say charity. But sometimes it's about ruling out what isn't appropriate, but it's what's appropriate for the charity, not what's appropriate for you. So if you're a cancer charity, for example, a lung cancer charity, you probably shouldn't be investing in tobacco. That's entirely inappropriate. But if you are a charity that helps donkeys and the tobacco shares are going to give you the best return, is that appropriate for your organisation, even though you, as a trustee, may not want to do that individually? So that's a conversation to have with the board. It should be about your charity rather than your own particular thing. Positive investment is coming quite popular at the moment as well. So you might have an environmental charity taking one shareholding in BP or Shell or somebody like that, so they can go to the AGM and they can try to lobby and different things. So it's quite an interesting time for investments at the moment. I suppose the main thing I would suggest, which comes onto the third bullet point, is to consider the need to seek appropriate advice. I would strongly recommend that any charity who's looking at investment do so with the help of professional advisors. It's clear in terms of Oscar's allowance and the Acts that is very much the expected and the norm now. In 2005, often charity trustees would have an individual on the board who was canny with this type of thing, maybe been an investment manager before, and they would often just make the investment decisions that were directly held. The market has moved on, the risk is too high, and things have moved away from that just now. So it's very much anticipated that you would have a professional advisor who would help with that. If you are doing so, select agents with care. Do they understand what charities are? Charities aren't subject to capital gains tax on their investments, whereas other organisations are. So it needs to be somebody who understands what Oscar will expect of you and what the charity itself can and can't do under the rules. Set guidelines. What are you looking for here? Are there any that you want to rule out? Are there any that you want to rule in? Are there any particular concerns about, sweatshops and the ESG of the underlying companies? Because often that's something that they can look at specifically. What are the costs going to be? Make sure you understand the full costs. It might not just be the financial advisor, the wealth manager's charge. If they're investing in products, is there an underlying charge? Do you have a requirement of income? Should that be a set amount each month or otherwise? Can you spend the capital that you have, or are you restricted just to the income? If you are restricted just to the income, can you look at the growth in the policy as income? All of that is things that you have to consider as a charity trustee if you're looking at investments. You should have a reserves policy, and the reserves policy for every organisation is different. It used to be a rule of thumb, how much would it cost to wind up, or how much does it cost for 3 months running costs if the tap was switched off. I think COVID really put that into stark relief, where we saw organisations who historically got amazing funding, but events couldn't be run. Churches couldn't have collection plates. They couldn't hire their halls out. Really difficult times for organisations. So the reserve is key in what you're going to do with that. And I think it's sensible to have an investment statement that I would encourage you to write. Those are mandatory in England and Wales. They're not up here, but there's really good guidance on Oscar's website that they did with Julie Hutchison, I think potentially Brewin Dolphin as well. So Standard Life and Brewin Dolphin, with more information on how to write an investment statement, and that's the type of thing that will go into your accounts. So lots of specific investment duties, but don't think, okay, we don't have a share portfolio, we don't need to think about that. It may be more. I want to chat a little bit about notifiable events, because these are the type of thing that aren't in statute, but it's one of these things, if you know, you know. Oscar have been very keen to highlight them, but they haven't become part of the new Act. And I think it's because this in itself is meant to be a sign of good governance. If you understand what notifiable events are and make a notifiable event to OSCR, they view that as a really clear sign that trustees understand what their duties are and are acting accordingly. So there's a list of notifiable events there. And again, I'd encourage you to look at OSCR's website because they've got really good guidance on this with actually quite helpful examples of what might or might not constitute a notifiable event. So for example, fraud or theft, there's a big difference between running a baking stall and somebody taking an extra brownie to a member of your staff embezzling. You know, it's a wide remit, but it's what makes a significant impact in your charity, and what will make a significant impact of your charity will depend on the charity itself. My view on notifiable events is it's absolutely something with significant impact on the charity, but also if you think that somebody is going to complain about you to OSCR to say that you handled something poorly or that you didn't do something right, it's potentially worth putting in a notifiable event beforehand to say, look, we've had this complaint, we've dealt with the issue, here's what happened, here's what we did about it, and here's why it's not going to happen again. And that way, if somebody does complain to OSCR, then OSCR can see that you have taken it seriously and what you've done about it, so you're already on the front foot. If you're considering making a notifiable event as a board, but you've decided, actually, do you know, it's not quite serious enough, we think that, you know, we're dealing with it, we don't think we should make a notifiable event, minute that. Because if OSCR come to you because somebody's complained and they say, well, actually, we think you should make a notifiable event here, and you didn't, and you say, well, we considered it and we considered the significance of it, and we didn't think that it materially or significantly impacted on the charity because of A, B, and C, then that in itself is really good evidence for OSCR that you understood what you were doing. One thing as a charity trustee that I would encourage you to do that is a kind of aside, Tracy mentioned, you know, go and visit the charity, go and understand who the service users are, the staff, and that type of thing. I think that's incredibly important when it comes to notifiable event and potential whistleblowing. You know, if you as a trustee aren't visible to the staff or aren't accessible to other people in the organisation, you're effectively relying on the chief exec or whoever that may be. Often the chief exec is, you know, the head of fight. They do everything in smaller charities. They probably don't even call themselves the chief exec, if I'm honest, but you're relying on the people within the charity to tell you when things goes wrong. And it can be quite a big thing to say to the board, do you know what, we've got this wrong, we've got this complaint in. So if somebody isn't, if the person that you would expect to tell you that isn't telling you that, who is going to tell you? How do they access you? So the first thing that I did when I was a trustee of an organisation that ran a visitors attraction was to go in and kind of poke my head in the office and say, hi, I'm Leanne, nice to meet you, and just pop in whenever I was passing to make yourself visible. Now, thankfully, they never did come to me with anything, but it was reassuring to me as a trustee to know that there was the ability for somebody to come to me. You need to be very careful, I would say, because you don't want to be, you know, going over the chief exec's head. The people need to be given their place, but ultimately to protect the charity is more important. So there needs to be a degree of visibility there. So I would encourage you to think about that. So a general note to self as a charity trustee, this is my checklist. So if I'm on the board of trustees and we're considering making a decision, does it match my charity purpose? Are there any regulations or legislation relevant? So is there a care inspectorate thing that needs done? Is there a health and safety? Is there a data protection? Is there anything else that isn't really charitable but still has an impact that we need to know about? And if so, has it been dealt with? Does it fit with the agreed strategy? Charities spend a lot of time agreeing a strategy, 3-year, 5-year, and then often chase the funding. Now, it may be that there's really good reason to chase the funding, but at least go back and say, well, it doesn't fit with our agreed strategy, but we are making a conscious decision to deviate from that rather than just sleepwalking into it. What's the impact on the budget? You know, can you afford it? Times are tight, particularly tight, I would say, for core funding. For those of you who've been a charity trustee for a while, I think now I'm not saying it's easy to raise project funds, but it's far easier to raise funds for specific projects than it is for actual core funding. So have a consideration. Yes, you might be able to get that fundraising, but is it restricted for that project? And how are you going to keep the lights on? How are you going to pay the rest of the staff? So think that through and understand the accounts of the organisation. I'll come on to that a little bit later. Do you have the skills to implement it? You know, it might be a brilliant project, but is it the right thing for you? Can you do it? And is there any private benefit? So ultimately, when Oscars, any charity that's in the register should have charitable purposes and provide a public benefit. Now, many charities will provide a private benefit. Any charity who employs somebody is privately benefiting that individual, but the the public benefit should overshadow that fully. So is there a private benefit? For example, are you paying rent to somebody for a building? And if so, is it more than the market rent? That doesn't sit comfortably. That's a private benefit. So think about if you should be doing that and why you're doing that. I mentioned the accounts a little bit earlier on. Often charity boards will have accountants on the board, which is great. And you know, that will hold a lot of weight in terms of the discussions around the finances. But charity trustees are jointly liable for things, so you need to be comfortable with it. I'm not saying that you need to suddenly turn yourself into an accountant, but when you look at the accounts or the management accounts, do you understand what that means? Do you understand what is committed to and what's discretionary? Do you understand what is a restricted fund rather than a designated fund, and how the two differ in terms of your cash flow? Ask these questions because it's imperative that you do understand it, because ultimately if the charity goes down or can no longer operate, you will feel individually responsible if you're talking about redundancies and that type of thing, but reputationally there's a risk to you. So make sure that you absolutely understand the accounts. Ask to sit down with a finance officer, ask to sit down with the accountants. The charity will be delighted that you're taking such an active interest. So don't feel that it's a daft thing to do, but you should fully understand where it's coming from. I'm going to whip quickly through the Charities Act because it is now an act. We had a charities bill that was kicking around for some time, punctuated by COVID, but it has now been passed. The highlights are that it publishes accounts. There's going to be a public register of trustees. There'll be a public register of disqualification of trustees and senior management. I noticed that a few of the people who put into the chat weren't actually trustees, they were managers in organisations, so they can also be disqualified. Charities must have a connection to Scotland. That is very, very loose. So they must be operational in Scotland or be registered in Scotland or have Scottish trustees, or, you know, basically the Oscar doesn't want to enter something into the register that has absolutely no link to Scotland, but is just trying to call themselves a registered charity. There will be a register of mergers. Now, this is brilliant news for the sector because if organisations wind up or merge, previously it meant that if the previous organisation got a legacy, after it had wound up, the legacy was lost or it could be lost, whereas now it should carry forward to the new organisation, which is brilliant. And there's new powers for Oscar, which include the power to appoint interim trustees, to issue positive directions. So just now they can tell you not to do something, but they can't make you do something, so that will change. To investigate former charities and trustees. At the moment, if you say, well, actually, we're just going to wind up, they have, once you're wound up, they have to stop, whereas it's entirely appropriate for them to continue if there's been misuse of funds, and to remove charities from the register. I'm not going to go into much more detail on that because what I think is key is that it isn't, although it's an act, it isn't in force yet, and we have had no indication of when each part is going to be in force. I don't think Oscar currently have the budget to pay for some of the software, etc., that will be needed to make this happen. So realistically, I think we're talking, I suspect things will come in a piecemeal fashion. I have no founding for this, but my gut instinct is at the moment, when you look up a charity online, you'll see that the individual names of people are redacted. I think that will go first because it doesn't take any budget not to black something out. I think so that will be the first thing to go, and then it'll just be piecemeal in the way in. I suspect we're probably looking by 2025, summer 2025, before it's all in.
Can I just ask, Leanne,
Yeah.
sorry, when you were saying about the new act, somebody's asked about the requirement for Scottish charities to conduct the majority of their activities in Scotland, and he's wondering how's that going to affect international organisations.
So it shouldn't. It should have a link to Scotland, but it doesn't need to benefit Scotland in the majority. So there's a lot of Scottish charities who do no good in Scotland, if I can put it that way. So their entire operations are elsewhere. So Malawi, there's great links between Scotland and Malawi, but a lot of the charities who are set up for the benefit of Malawi will only benefit people in Malawi. That's fine. But they could be registered in Scotland if they are based in Scotland, or if they're trustees in Scotland, or if they're set up as a Scottish trust or a Scottish company or a SCVO. It's not about keeping funds in Scotland. It's about Oscar having jurisdiction effectively if things go wrong. So if they suddenly found out that all of that money was going to Malawi but was actually going into the pocket of 3 people and no good was being done, Oscar want to be able to close down the charity effectively, or to put take action against the charity, whatever that might look like. So it's more about Oscar being able to have a handle on the charity. At the moment, or before this act, if you were a charity in Zimbabwe set up for the benefit of people in Zimbabwe, with all people from Zimbabwe on there with no link to Scotland, you could still ask to be entered into the register, which just seems bonkers because there's no link, there's no need for Scotland to be involved. And Oscar's concern was, they said that there was like literally a handful of charities that were grandfathered on that was like this. They don't think it's a big problem. But if you in Zimbabwe have this charity and you want to get some gravitas, you could, in theory, register it with Oscar and say, well, we're a Scottish registered charity, which gives them a gravitas that they shouldn't have. So that's what that's trying to achieve, this benefit, this link to Scotland. It's less about the funds being used there and more about having that jurisdiction over the organisation. Does that answer the question?
It does, yes, thank you.
Okay. So here are some things that they haven't done. They didn't change the charitable purpose or public benefit. They didn't do anything with notifiable events. They didn't do any extensions for reorganisation. So just now, if you are a unincorporated organisation or a trust, you had to go before. You can now go to Oscar and say, look, we don't really like our constitution, but we don't have the power to change it. Can you give us that power? We'd quite like to make a few amendments. And Oscar are quite receptive to that. You can't do that for some organisation like Royal Charters. And to change a Royal Charter, you're talking about private acts of Parliament, the Privy Council. And for all of these words, just think expensive, all of it is. So it can actually be quite prohibitive for charities. So we kind of hoped that they might have done this for Royal Charters too, but they've not. And there was nothing about safeguarding reserves. There's some technical issues about SCVOs, which I think will get dealt with separately. Not particularly exciting, worth mentioning here, just for charity geeks like me. We thought there might be a little bit about remuneration of the trustees. Now, because so many big things were, I say missed, but actually not considered, they weren't covered, is probably a better way of doing it. The Scottish Government have undertaken to do another review of charity law, a more nuts and bolts one, because they recognise that the previous one was tinkering around the edges. So they have given an undertaking that they will look at that. However, on the sidelines, it seems to me that they kind of have their hands full at the moment. So when that will be, who knows? But it's a watch this space. I suspect that the more interesting thing in the short term will be when we start to see the different things that have already been passed in the Act coming into force. And the best way to keep in touch with that, I'm sure that SCVO will be sending out emails and things. So I would encourage you to sign up to the trustees. What did you call it, Tracy? Trustees? I want to say club, but that's not the right word.
Trustees Network, and we do a bulletin, a regular bulletin.
Yeah. So I'd encourage you to sign up to that, and also Oscar's bulletin, because they do updates as well. So that's where you're more likely to see it coming through. It's not headline making. Okay, so future proofing, a little bit to think about. Diversity and inclusion, I'll come back to that in a moment. Trustee recruitment, what does your deeds, your constitution say about trustees? I quite naively came into this previously. Best practice from Oscar, I'll start with that. Best practice, Oscar quite like if you have fixed term appointments that you can go for a few different years. So, 3-year fixed term appointments for 2 or 3 years, and then they have to take a break. So it's a good way of getting fresh blood into the organisation. And I think that that is brilliant. If in an ideal world, we would all be doing that. However, it's not an ideal world, and sometimes it can be quite tricky to recruit trustees. I think that's going to become more so as their names become more public. So think about your trustee recruitment. Who are you looking for on a skills basis? But do you have fixed term appointments, and are people's fixed terms coming to an end, and what are you going to do about it? I prefer, my preference now is to go for, you know, fixed term appointments for 3 years, but that can roll. So you can still have those succession conversations with people 6 months before their term is due to end, so they don't feel bound in for life. But at the same time, if you've got an amazing trustee who's really involved, do you want to have to lose them just because they've served their time? So it's something to think about. Transparency is key. It's a real, it's really at the heart of a lot of the things that the Scottish Government are doing at the moment with terms of RCI that I'll come on to. And the new Act, you can see that there's going to be this public register of trustees, things won't be redacted anymore. So think about what information is in the public. It's great for charities to be transparent, but don't feel you have to put everything into the public. Some of the model constitutions say that all minutes should be published, or if a member of the public asks for a minute of meetings, that you have to give them it. If that's in the constitution, you absolutely do have to do that. But why have it in the constitution? If you don't have it in there and a member of the public comes to you, you can still give them it. But there might be quite sensitive issues that you want to discuss. So have a think around that. Source of funds is becoming really quite topical at the moment from two sides. First of all, a lot of organisations in Scotland that have been going for hundreds of years will have some link to slavery. Unfortunately, the people who could afford to set up endowed funds probably at some point had a link to slavery because that was the society at the time. But what does that mean for the charity now? Should it be repatriating funds? What should it be thinking about there? I had an interesting conversation with the museum about the totem pole. I'm sure that's not the right word for it, but the monument that was returned to Canada, and why they decided to do that. But at the same time, and it was within their purposes, I think that was a really good news story. But at the same time, if your trust is or charity is set up to benefit people in Scotland, then can you put funds elsewhere? So there's consideration about that. There was also the stuff at the book festival with Greta Thunberg saying, you know, be careful who your sponsors are, which I think personally was very unfair. But it's becoming quite a topical time. So trustees should consider having an ethical fundraising policy and understanding where their money is coming from, why they think it's in the best interest of the charity to accept it. And if they don't want to accept it, they have to be very clear on why it's not in the best interest of the charity for that. Oscar have been quite quiet around that, but the Charity Commission, the chair of the Charity Commission came out quite strongly and said, you know, charities cannot afford to be squeamish about where, that was the word, squeamish about where funds are coming from. If they have to refuse funding, then you have to be very clear why it's in the best interest of the charity to do so, and not just because the individual trustees don't agree with the where the funds are coming from. So that's a topical one, and we'll continue. What are the environmental impact of what the charity is doing? Somebody in a medical charity said to me recently that flying is the new smoking in terms of being socially acceptable. They used to fly surgeons out to show people how to do particular things or to go to conferences. What impact is that having on the environment? So can you be doing a Teams call instead? So have a consideration about the environmental side, but it's all opportunity. So future, I think there'll be more law reform. I think there'll be less charities. Potentially there'll be more social enterprise. I think there'll be more partnership working, and I would encourage that. The press we're going through a difficult time with the press. We got through, I'm just checking my time, we got through COVID where the press was saying how wonderful charities were, and we've now come on the other side where they're quite happy to criticise. Oscar it'll be interesting to see how they use their new powers, particularly the ones to make directives, because there's a difference, you know, when does the regulator become the operator if people are making decisions about how the charity should run? Diversity inclusion, people who've heard me speak before will have seen this slide, but I just think it's quite interesting. You know, I am 40, so I was a child of the 80s. So when I ask people to think about a time machine, and I think of a DeLorean, I think of Michael J. Fox. Our trainees thought of some kind of atomizer, and some of my more senior partners thought of the more Jules Verne thing. So if that's the diversity of thought coming for one silly little thing, think about what that could bring to the board. So my view, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's not necessarily a tick box exercise. It's not about how many males, females, others, ethnicities. It's what are people bringing, what is their life story, and what is the diversity of thought rather than the diversity of protected characteristics. Some things to think about: keep up to date, understand your structure, review GDPR, the dreaded GDPR. We all got very excited about it when it came in, about data protection, and we all put policies in place and then probably put them in a drawer, hopefully a locked one, given it's GDPR. But your organization's probably moved on. You might be doing home working, you might be doing other things. Have you reviewed your GDPR, and is it still in line with it? Can you do online meetings? Do you have a risk matrix? And if so, is it up to date, and do people understand what it is? Your conflict policy I spoke about, and Tracy spoke about the conduct policy. Trustee recruitment I've covered, and your constitution, is it still fit for purpose? Does it do what you need it to do? And if it doesn't, change it. It's not set in stone. One thing that I thought was on the slide, but it isn't, is one of the new requirements that's coming through that doesn't have a charity exemption is RCI. So that's called Register of Controlling Interests in Land. So if you are a charity that owns land, it might apply to you. I feel like I'm doing this thing, you know, when you go to these fundraisers and everybody stands up and they say, if you're wearing blue, sit down. So if you're a charity that owns land, stand up. If you are a company or a SCVO, you can sit down. So that should leave us with charities that are trusts or unincorporated organisations that are owning land. If that is your type of charity, you might be impacted by RCI, and that means that when the property was first bought or transferred into the charity, it would have gone into the name of the trustees at that time. Now you will have a link showing who the trustees were and how they've moved, but that doesn't automatically go back to the land register. So if the trustees now aren't the trustees then, you need to do a register controlling interest of land, which needs to be in next year. They gave us an extension because it was meant to be effective from the 1st of April this year, and it's a criminal offence if you don't, but nobody have heard about it and nobody had done it. So we've got an extension to next year, but it's something that I would very much encourage you to do. We've lobbied the Scottish Government to try to change it and give an exemption for charities, because so many community halls, churches, all of this type of thing will have charity trustees that change quite frequently. But if that is the case and they're not a SCVO or a company limited by guarantee, they will have to make sure they update the register. So it's just something to put on your agenda for December or January and hope that it's done by the 1st of March. But we've got some information about it. I'm sure SCVO do as well. So just reach out if you need help with that. So sorry, a bit of a whistle stop tour, but I'll hand over back to Tracy in case anything's been coming in that I've missed, and I'll stop sharing.